Today's exercise is 8 questions long, and these 8 questions appear within a model academic task 1 response, which I have written myself in response to a question that was seen on the IELTS exam in Wollongong, Australia in early 2012. So let me just explain very quickly how the questions work in this lesson. So you will see sentences that look like this, and you will have to choose the correct wording from 2 options. So for example, his ability to speak fluently improved after living abroad, or his skills to speak fluently improved after living abroad. So of course here the correct answer would be ability. Okay, so you will see 8 questions just like this one in the following model response. And I encourage you to try to make a mental note of how many you get correct, and feel free to post your score at the end of the video to the comments section. Now let's go to the task itself and read through it and look at the graph. So here we have the following graph outlines paper and plastic cup production at a factory over the period of 1 year. Write a brief report of at least 150 words describing the information depicted. Okay, I'll give you a few seconds to read that to yourself. Okay, so we're going to see a graph. The graph is going to show us the output of a factory that makes both paper and plastic cups. We are not given the name of the factory. We're not given any country or location where the factory is from. We are not given a specific date for which year this period of time occurs in. We're just told that this is over the period of 1 year. So now if we look at the graph together, so what you can see is that along the y-axis here, we have units of cups produced. So starting at 0, going up to 2 million. And along the x-axis, we have months of the year. Now something I would like to say before we get started is a thank you to our friend Rumi in Bangladesh, who is the nice person that responded to a request that I posted to my blog asking for the creation of this data source. So Rumi, thank you for making this for us for the purpose of this lesson today. Now what's interesting about this graph is that you know, as you can see on the right hand side, blue represents paper and red represents plastic for the different cups. And what's interesting is that the values are very varied over the course of the year. So starting from January and ending in December, it's very difficult to see sort of a progression in one direction at any point of the year for either plastic or paper. It seems to be that the entire graph is very volatile. There's you know, there's a little bit of pattern in some places, but I mean for the most part the graph is unpredictable from one month to the next. So, even if we just look at January and February, I mean, the values are so different, and then going into March, it changes again. So I think that this graph is going to, be a real challenge for us to write a response to. And in my experience, I don't remember ever seeing something quite so volatile. But you never know what you might get on the exam. So it's possible that something could come up that's this volatile. So now what do we see in the graph? Well, we see that paper, which is in blue, appears to go up and come down a few months, and then it hits a bit of a plateau between May and July. So there's not much of a change there. And then it dips down to September, and then it jumps up and comes down again in December. So, the trend for paper is, we can say it's volatile. There's no real predictable pattern there throughout the year. A little, a few common months here in the middle, but for the most part, from one month to the next, it's unpredictable. Now, plastic is even more unpredictable. If you look at the way the plastic, plastic cups, the volume of plastic cups that are produced, month to month. So it goes down from January to February, goes up again in March, down again, up, and then, down between August and September, up November, and then down again to December. So also quite volatile. Now, one thing that I noticed, and I only noticed this after I finished writing the response, is that unfortunately our graph is missing October. So we'll have to, just for today, just forget about October because it doesn't appear in our graph. I think that was just a small mistake, when the graph was being made. Yeah, so we'll just forget about that for today. So we have two volatile trends. One for paper cups being produced over the course of a year, and one for plastic cups being produced over the course of a year. Okay, let's get started. So I'm going to read the model response, and please mentally choose the wording that you feel is strongest. This graph shows the vary volatility production quantities of paper and plastic cups over the course of 1 year. Or, this graph shows the very volatile production quantities of paper and plastic cups over the course of 1 year. And the answer here would be volatile. So when we're talking about production and production quantities, we have a noun, and we need a word that can qualify this noun. So the word volatile is an adjective, and this is the word that we would use to couple with production quantities. No obvious correlation between the manufacturing levels of each cup type appears to be present, or appear to be present. Okay, so now this sentence is a little bit complicated. When you get down to this point, some students might think that we're talking about the noun levels when we use appears or appear, but that's not true. Actually, we're referring back to the word correlation. And so correlation is a singular noun, so of course this would have to be appears. Now that finishes the introduction portion, the overview paragraph of our response. Let's get to the first analyzing paragraph, which will talk about paper cup production at this factory. From 1.1 million units in January, the paper cup figure grows to roughly 1.7 million units in February, before dropping to almost its original value in March, or before dropping to modestly its original value in March. And here the correct word would be almost. Modestly is a word we'd use to describe the quality of change a figure experiences. So here it would be a little bit awkward to say modestly its original value. But for example, we could say something modestly grew or modestly fell. But we couldn't use it in this particular instance. The word modest itself just means small. So, if it's a small change, we could say, oh, it's a modest growth or a modest fall. Let's continue. It then climbs to just shy of 1.8 million units in April, prior to hitting a plateau of roughly 1.2 million finished cups during May, June, and July. Or we could say, it then climbs to just shy of 1.8 million units in April, prior to hit a plateau of roughly 1.2 million finished cups during May, June, and July. And here the correct word would be hitting. So hitting. Now, hitting is an example of something called a gerund, which is a word that is formed from a verb. So here in this instance, hit is a verb, but we're changing this by adding ing and making a word that acts like a noun, which is a gerund. Now, when we use the phrase prior to is a phrase that we often couple with gerunds. So we could say prior to hitting, or prior to falling, prior to dropping, prior to growing, prior to spiking. So in your own writing, if you want to use this phrase prior to, just remember that we often couple it, not always, but often we couple it with a gerund. So if you're writing something, then just think, well, how can I change the verb that I want to stick in here into a word that acts like a noun? And we do that by adding ing. So if you are talking about something that fell and you want to use prior to, which means before, then you would need to add ing and say prior to falling. Okay, let's continue. This number falls steadily to less than 1 million to September, and then jumps to over 1.5 million units in October. Or we can say, I'll read it again from the beginning. This number falls steadily to less than 1 million by September, and then jumps to over 1.5 million units in October. And like we were saying before, October is actually not in our graphs. This would be November. Okay, so the correct answer here would be by. If we used to, this would be awkward. We wouldn't say, to September, 1 million to September. We would use by. So the phrase by here means the figure less than 1 million is reached sometime in September. So this figure, less than 1 million by September. So sometime in September, the figure falls to less than 1 million. Paper cup levels finish the year at a hair less than 1.2 million. A hair less. Perhaps another phrase that you might be interested in committing to memory. This means very, very slightly less than. So if you look at your graph, you'll see that at this point in the year, the figure is almost at 1.2 million, but not quite. Okay, now let's start the second analyzing paragraph, which, as I told you before, refers to the figures seen for plastic cups. Equally unpredictable, plastic cups commence the year at fewer than 1.2 million units. Or, equally irrational, plastic cups commence the year at fewer than 1.2 million units. Okay, and here we would use the word unpredictable. So the figures, as they appear on the graph, are rather unpredictable. They go up and they go down, and they go up and they go down, and we would not want to use the word irrational. Irrational is a word that means illogical, and that's not accurate. The figures that we see in the graph are not illogical. I mean, maybe they're perfectly logical to this company, but but we don't know that. We don't know whether they are or they aren't. So we wouldn't say they're illogical. We would have to say they're perhaps unpredictable to us as viewers of the graph. So equally unpredictable, plastic cups commence the year at fewer than 1.2 million units. The months of February, April, June, August, September, and December all hover at roughly 1 million finished products each. And I'm just going to stop for 1 second. The word hover might be new to some people. Hover means kind of to, be at a certain level, maybe a little bit above, maybe a little bit below, but roughly that level. So when we say roughly 1 million, and hover, so they hover at 1 million, that means it might be a little bit over 1 million, it might be a little bit under 1 million, but about 1 million. Hover. Between these months, however, production values spike to varying levels, the highest of these being in July at 1.75 million. Or we could say between these months, however, production values dip to varying levels, the highest of these being in July at 1.75 million. Now, to answer this question properly, you will need to look at the graph. So grammatically speaking, spike and dip are both correct. The problem is that one describes the trend that we see on the graph and one does not. So if you look at July for plastic cups, you will see that this is a value that goes very, very high and kind of makes a bit of a point on the graph. And we call this in English a spike when something goes up dramatically. So the answer here would be spike. The word dip would be to kind of decrease, and this kind of decrease, a dip is not a major decrease, but it's also not a minor decrease. It's sort of, it would be kind of a middle decrease, a dip. So a dip in sales that would be better than a plunge in sales. A plunge in sales would be, if the company had a plunge in sales, their sales would go down very drastically. But a dip would be that they went down a little bit. And a modest decrease would be to go down a very little bit. So spike to varying levels, the highest of these being in July at 1.75 million. Total plastic cup production for the year appears almost approximately equal to that of paper. Or total plastic cup production for the year appears to be approximately equal to that of paper. And here the answer would be to be. So the word almost, we cannot couple this with approximately, because approximately is not a definite value. We can't say something is almost not definite. No, the word almost means close to, and then after that you'd have to say a definite value. So we can say it's almost 1 million. 1 million is a definite value. But we can't say it's almost approximately, because approximately is not a definite value. So the answer would be to be, approximately equal to that of paper. Okay, that is the end of the quiz. I hope that you will post your score out of 8, and please share with me a bit of feedback and what you think of these kinds of lessons, whether you find them helpful or not. So that's the end of the lesson. Thank you for listening, and have a nice evening.